World War I chaplains serving in Gallipoli had to endure bombardment and being fired upon as they were within range of the enemy's guns all the time. Burying the dead and attending the wounded became an extremely dangerous task. By late 1914, trench warfare had embedded itself on the Western Front, and the Ottoman Empire had entered the war on the side of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Early in 1915, the Allies were looking at possible strategies to open up new offensives. The Russians appealed to Britain for help against the Turks in the Caucasus. In response, the Allies decided to launch a naval expedition to seize the Dardanelles Straits. If successful, capture of the Straits would allow the Allies to take Constantinople and remove Turkey from the war. In April, the Gallipoli campaign began with a naval attack which was followed up by a major land invasion involving British, French, Australian and New Zealand troops. The invasion force landed on the beaches of the peninsula, but were met with fierce Turkish resistance. The invasion stalled. 6 months on, Allied forces had suffered heavy casualties and had made slow progress from their initial landing sites.
Chaplains in the Gallipoli campaign, of course, faced something entirely different, which was an assault landing on a beach. I mean, the nearest thing would have been to D-Day, in a sense. Unexpectedly, it came under much more severe fire than the generals had anticipated, and it wasn't unopposed. Very rapidly, the peninsula formed its own trench lines, and the war in Gallipoli took on a character that was very similar to that on the Western Front, except that because the rear areas were much closer, there wasn't a kind of protected rear area. If you were on the peninsula, you were in the range of the Turkish guns. The British chaplain who stands out most clearly in the Gallipoli campaign is Father Finn, who's a Catholic and who's killed on the first morning of the battle. He's the first army chaplain to die in enemy action in World War I.
He was attached to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. Their task was V Beach at Cape Helles, the southern tip of the Gallipoli Peninsula. He was under orders to remain on the SS River Clyde while the troops made the initial landings. But anxious to be with the troops, he asked to be allowed to go with them. So Father Finn landed with them, and seeing the men being mown down and hearing their cries, made his way down the gangplank and received almost immediately a chest wound. He scrambled ashore, receiving more wounds. The last time Father Finn was seen, he was crawling up the beach, holding up his injured right arm, giving absolution to the dying men. Then he died.
It was quite remarkable because, of course, his example, in many respects, fulfilled what most chaplains on the Western Front were seeking to do. He died literally in the surf at Gallipoli whilst ministering to wounded soldiers. And he was celebrated. Obviously, he was claimed by the Irish community across the British Empire. He's celebrated even in America by Irish Americans as setting this prototypical example of where the chaplain should be and how a chaplain should die if indeed they are killed. So Father Finn, very widely respected, the first chaplain to set the sort of example which so many chaplains followed during the course of the war. The Gallipoli campaign in many respects helps to precipitate change in chaplaincy affairs on the Western Front. Many of the prohibitions, for example, and many of the conditions which apply on the Western Front cannot possibly be applied at Gallipoli. For example, given the shallow nature of many of the British and Allied footholds on the coast of the peninsula, essentially trying to keep chaplains out of the front line is nonsensical because wherever you go is practically the front line. So it's the experience of Gallipoli which also helps to undermine this prohibition on chaplains serving in the front line on the Western Front. The work of the chaplain at Gallipoli in many respects prefigures, in terms of frontline ministry, what takes place on the Western Front in subsequent months, particularly after Haig is appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force. One of the chaplains who really does make his mark at Gallipoli with the Australians is a Salvation Army chaplain, a Salvationist. Now, Salvationists are not appointed chaplains, are not commissioned as chaplains in the British Army until 1918, interestingly enough, because the Salvation Army in Britain prefers the welfare work which is pursued in Salvation Army huts. But the Australian experience of Gallipoli really does underline the example that could be set by smaller denominations, because of course in Britain the dominant church is the Church of England. In Australia and in elsewhere in the Empire this is not quite the case, so the Anglicans are less front and centre than they are in the British Army, in organisations like the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps.
Chaplain William Mackenzie of the Salvation Army was attached to the 4th Battalion Australian Imperial Force. In the first few days at Gallipoli, with bullets flying over his head, he buried his commanding officer and over 100 men. This was the beginning of many burials he would perform. He was well known for staying with the men and going over the top with them and bringing the wounded in under fire. He had acquired many bullet holes in his cap from all the close calls he had. He used to say to the men, "I've preached and prayed with you. Do you think I'm afraid to die with you?" Father John Fay was assigned to the 11th Battalion Australian Imperial Force. He found himself with the men on the beach of Anzac Cove after disregarding an order to remain on board ship. He insisted his place was by his men. During the Gallipoli campaign, Fay found bullet holes in his overcoat. Objects were being shot out of his hand, but he continued unharmed to minister to the men. It was noted that he wasn't scared to go where the bullets fall pretty thickly. Shortly after this picture was taken at the Presbytery of Cairo in 1915, 2 of the chaplains standing in the back row were killed at Gallipoli. They were Chaplain Andrew Gillison of the Australian Infantry Force and Senior Presbyterian Chaplain William Grant of the main Expeditionary Force under the New Zealand Mounted Rifles Brigade. It was reported that Grant took no notice of shrapnel and bullets. He didn't care where he slept, as long as he was with his boys. He died going into the enemy trenches, seeking wounded Australian and New Zealand soldiers. Instead, he found some wounded Turks and dressed their wounds before he was killed in the trench.
With regards to fatalities on the battlefield, it was a command decision as to where and when burial was possible. And the military structure would decide to set up short-term grave sites, and the chaplains were often called to assist in that process. As the war progressed, many of the chaplains became experts at setting up field cemeteries, working closely with the Royal Engineers in the registration of graves, the registration of those who were deceased, where they were buried, and making maps so that future organisations could then come and exhume as necessary and remove the remains to a permanent cemetery, and that happened.
Chaplains, in terms of burial of the dead, it's very easy to overlook what that actually entailed and the demands which that made on individual chaplains. And it's important to bear in mind that these chaplains, by and large, fulfil that duty with tremendous commitment and with tremendous sense of obligation. So it's not simply a question of presiding over a quiet civilian-style funeral. These are burials that take place in the most extreme conditions and which make tremendous demands on those who participate. And chaplains are actually leading the show, so to speak. Many of the dead from the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1916, are not buried for months. And one of the chaplains who is responsible for burying large numbers of these soldiers is actually awarded a DSO for this task, because it's noted that the working parties who he's directing often have to essentially be pulled out and replaced, because dealing with decomposing bodies is a very demoralising, very depressing experience. This chaplain persists, he soldiers on, as it were. He is the person who ensures that these men are ultimately given a decent Christian burial, and it's his willpower, effectively, which ensures that that happens, that that takes place.
Meanwhile, on the Western Front, some of the Canadian chaplains were experiencing the casualties of war for the first time, like 51-year-old Baptist chaplain John Mcdonald, serving with the 5th Field Ambulance. In one of his early letters he writes,
"Whenever I get an opportunity, I go on one of the ambulances to the advanced dressing station, to which the wounded men are first conveyed. At these stations, all of which are close to the trenches, is rendered whatever first aid may be necessary. I happened to be in the ambulance which brought in the first casualty that took place in our division, a poor lad who was sniped on the way to the trenches. As I rode with these wounded boys, I endeavour to cheer and comfort them as best I can. During the day, I make a point to read to the patients, and not infrequently to write a line for them to the folks at home."
General Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces on the Western Front, said, "A good chaplain is as valuable as a good general."
The role of the chaplain on the Western Front is actually revolutionised after the appointment of Sir Douglas Haig as Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force in December 1915. It's Haig who, as a firm, believing Christian man, sees the value of the chaplain and wants the chaplain to exert his influence as widely as possible, particularly in the front line. And Haig derived enormous comfort from passages of scripture which were expounded upon by his headquarters chaplain George S. Duncan on a regular basis, and Haig's personal diary throughout campaigns such as Third Ypres and on into the crisis of the German Spring Offensive of March 1918 are sprinkled, liberally scattered with biblical references, allusions, and with a strong sense of comfort and reassurance that Haig derived from his reading of the Bible. And what's very significant is that only a month after Haig is appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, he convenes a conference of his senior commanders and says essentially, we have to do more with our chaplains. We have to ensure that they have access to the troops, that they're encouraging their morale, and ultimately, of course, this leaves the door open to them accessing the front line. So by the time of the Battle of the Somme in the summer of 1916, chaplains have unfettered freedom of manoeuvre into the frontline trenches, even into no man's land during attacks. There are very practical constraints towards the front line on where and when you can actually hold services. Obviously, if you're within artillery range of the German lines, then effectively you can only hold very small services. There is actually regulations, there are orders passed that no more than a dozen men can assemble, for example, in a dugout towards the front line, because obviously if a shell was to hit the congregation, then it would do tremendous damage, kill a lot of people.
So quite often it would be 3, 4, 5 men gathered together for a brief word of prayer, an exhortation from the word, and a blessing and benediction. Or it would very much centre on the act of Holy Communion. But because of the need to get around as many people as possible, without disrupting the war effort, you often find that someone might do something like 14 services in one area, going between pockets of men, 3 to 5 to 7 men, as they went round doing those services. So they'd be very brief, very to the point. You may even ask them about their own backgrounds and their families and their loved ones, pray more specific for them, ask God's blessing on them, and then move on to the next 3 or 5 individuals and do a service with them.
We have to understand that under normal circumstances, and this is a reflection of how conscious Britain was of being a Christian society, that church attendance is actually required of soldiers until after the Second World War. So there are large parade services which are often resented by soldiers who feel that they should have the option of whether or not to go to church, because freedom of choice in religious matters is something which civilians would take for granted. But essentially, These services do vary in quality. Some are church parades. These are services which soldiers have to attend. Soldiers are never obliged to go to communion, however, and many chaplains on Sunday evenings and indeed on other days of the week would hold services, voluntary services, which are in many cases very well attended by the soldiers concerned.
Communion services were particularly asked for during that period, and we see many examples of soldiers writing home mentioning the fact that they had attended, and they may not have been regular churchgoers, but during their time in France or out in Palestine, I think that it was apparent that many people were very much influenced by how their chaplains were trying to help them. And I think, having experienced them myself later on in the end of the 20th century, I think they're very important.
Communion took on a new meaning and became something you could do even in the most difficult of circumstances. It pointed to the person of Christ, his death, his atonement, and even when words couldn't be spoken just before an assault or a reconnaissance mission, you could at least 2 or 3 people together could celebrate communion, and then they'd move to the next location further down the line. It was all pretty much agreed on where they would have it by the authorities to make sure they didn't get in the way of anything military, but there was always a time and place to have communion in trenches just like the one here.
Holy Communion was well attended amongst all denominations in the trenches of the Great War. William Ewing, a Church of Scotland chaplain serving in Gallipoli, wrote,
"The men down from the front seemed especially to value it, and our tent was often quite full. There was a peculiar solemnity and oppressiveness about the communion services, with many men of whom had narrowly escaped death, and would go forth on the morrow to face it again. The fellowship of the Holy Table yields a certain tranquillity and strength to the hearts of men who lack not courage, but to whom long-drawn conflict brings weariness."
Chaplain Thomas Jones described a moving communion service that he led during the Gallipoli campaign.
Services are not easily arranged on the peninsula, as being constantly within range of shell fire. Still, we managed to hold services, and at times, if well sheltered, there were large numbers attending and all show interest in singing and in the gospel message. One Sunday evening recently, our gathering was not more than 150, but all felt the presence of the Prince of Peace in spite of such tumult of war. At the close, the Lord's Supper was observed, and a season of real spiritual blessing experienced as we remembered him who laid down his life for his friends, and we prayed for our comrades in battle.
Chaplains were forward in the trenches as part of their visiting, and what we have within their memoirs and in their diaries and in their letters is that they would go forward, they would visit their troops, they would stay for a few hours or even a couple of days, then go back to the more rear lines and then go back to the forward aid post and to the field hospital. And some chaplains remained more forward than other chaplains. Some stayed there almost permanently, especially preparing for a major offensive, and actually went over the top with their soldiers during that offensive, unarmed, prepared to do any duty they could to help their soldiers find comfort and strength.
One of the roles of the chaplain, for example, when visiting the frontline trench, particularly at night, was to chat to sentries on duty and prevent them from falling asleep, which wasn't simply prudent from a military point of view, but it was a military offence to fall asleep on duty. In fact, it could incur the death penalty in extreme circumstances. So this visiting wasn't simply kind of rubbing shoulders with the men. It had often had a very significant practical value.
Ready? Come on, go! Move yourselves, go, 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 go!
I think one of the difficulties when we look at battles in World War I is how did anybody go up over the top? Because we know what happened to them afterwards. But particularly on the first day of the Somme, most of the British troops had been persuaded that the artillery barrage that had gone on for a week had destroyed the German positions and cut the wire. And if it wasn't going to be a stroll in the park, it was going to be relatively easy. So any chaplain who went over the top at that point wasn't necessarily expecting to move into a hail of bullets. This is a problem at Gallipoli with Father Finn. I mean, did he expect to suddenly face huge numbers of machine guns and to be killed immediately? And if so, would he have gone had he known it? Those who went believed that if soldiers were going to get wounded, then a chaplain has something that they can do for them, particularly for those in extremis, but also helping with stretcher bearers. If you form a close association with a group of men and they're doing a difficult and dangerous task, you want to be with them and to offer them what help you can.
Chaplains do have to exude a certain confidence. This is an unrecognised aspect of chaplaincy, is they have to keep their heads, they have to be models as far as possible of composure. So there is a particular onus placed on the chaplain in that regard, and of course chaplains are non-combatants, they can't fire back as well. So chaplains who do behave as they are expected often attract tremendous admiration for the serenity which in many respects they do project. But that's not to say that they all rise to the challenge. There's no doubt that chaplains did crack in the same way that other officers and other soldiers cracked as well. This is surprisingly rare, however. Chaplains who are not seen as coping with frontline conditions will be rapidly pulled back to safer areas, to base areas, or sent home to England. Under the circumstances and under the weight of expectation in which they are placed, it really is remarkable how well they bear up as a group.
We're on the banks of the River Somme. 5 k's behind me we have, of course, Fricourt and Mametz, an area that William Cram Charteris knew extremely well during the Somme offensive of 1916. But one thing he loved to do when he had the opportunity was to offer a voluntary service. And the 38th Division, the Welsh Division, to his surprise, through torrential rain, at 600 to 700, he estimates, Welsh soldiers turned up to this particular service. I think it'd be true to say he preached his heart. It's centered on Christ, on his death, on the salvation that he offers. Soldiers responded. Some went forward during his altar call, and others renewed their commitment through taking communion. It would, of course, be for many the last time they would have the opportunity to hear the gospel or celebrate communion. For soon after, many would die all around this area, buried in many of the small cemeteries surrounding us.
Coming up in World War I Military Chaplains Part 3, we look at chaplains who were awarded gallantry medals for their courage and commitment to the soldiers while under fire. We also highlight the role of Christian organisations such as the YMCA and the Salvation Army, who worked tirelessly looking after the well-being of the soldiers serving in the Great War.